In this lecture video, we're going to be looking at a debate about the ethics of sweatshops. So we're going to look at an argument from Zwolinski, which argues that sweatshops are ethical and that it would actually be unethical to try and stop them from existing. And then an argument from Jeremy Snyder, which is going to argue that sweatshops are unethical and that they're exploitative for a specific reason, with a specific kind of exploitation, what Snyder calls needs exploitation. So let's look at Zwolinski's article first, which is called Sweatshops, Choice, and Exploitation. So first, Zwolinski begins with arguing that an agent's choice is morally important. So the choice of an agent or their consent to some action is transformative insofar as it changes the normative relations in which others stand with respect to what they may do. So the kind of choice that an agent might make, right, out of their own free will is transformative because it means that certain others ought to respect that choice that the agent under their own free will makes. There are two ways in which then choices can be morally transformative. First, a choice might be morally transformative because it is an autonomy exercising choice, meaning the choice can be morally transformative if it's an exercise of an agent's autonomy. So in this way, we respect the choice made by an individual, even if we disagree with it, merely because we respect their autonomy. We respect them as a person to make choices for themselves. So an example of this might be that we respect the choice of a neighbor to practice a religion that we might personally disagree with, but we don't try and stop them from being able to practice that religion because we respect their autonomy, their ability to choose for themselves what religion they want to practice. Now, the second way in which a choice might be morally transformative is through a preference-evincing choice. So this doesn't focus on autonomy, but focuses on the preferences an individual might make. So these kinds of choices need to be respected even when the choice is made under conditions of less than full autonomy, and they need to be respected merely for the sake that this is the desire of the individual. So an example of this might be that it would be morally wrong for me to serve fish to a guest that has said they despise fish. So it's not the case then that I should respect their choice because I respect their autonomy, but because I respect the desire that they have chosen for themselves, right? So in the first case, it's more of a matter of not violating their negative liberty. In the second case, it's respecting their choice as an individual who can make choices for themselves. So we can see how this would affect then choice within the realm of employment. So first, right, if we respect the autonomy of an individual's choice, a worker's autonomous choice to accept conditions of employment establishes a strong claim to freedom from certain sorts of interference by others, even if the employment relationship isn't a morally praiseworthy one. So this means that individuals should respect the fact that certain people work at sweatshops, and they should not stop them from working at sweatshops because they should have their own ability to determine for themselves, right, where they want to work, for the sake that we should respect their autonomy as an individual. So Zwolinski says, sweatshop workers do not generally choose to work in order to gain some extra disposable income for luxuries or simply to take pleasure in the activity of working. They work to survive, or to help their family survive, or so their children can gain an education and escape the misery of poverty that drove them to sweatshops in the first place. Choices such as these involve projects, one's own survival, one's role as a parent or a spouse, that are of central importance to most people's lives. Such choice, when made autonomously, deserves respect. So we would be actually immoral in trying to stop someone from working at a sweatshop because we would be denying that agent their own autonomy to choose what kind of work they want to perform. Secondly, a worker's choice to accept sweatshop labor can be morally transformative by signaling information about their preferences showing that they prefer that kind of labor to any other alternative in the same way that someone might prefer eating, a salad to fish. So, Zwolinski says, sweatshop labor might not be the kind of thing for which she has any intrinsic desire. But when all things are considered, her poverty, the wages paid by the sweatshop, and that paid by alternative sources of employment, etc., she prefers working there to anything else she might do. And by expressing her preferences, her choice is morally transformative. So, to attempt to directly remove the option of sweatshop labor, while knowing that sweatshop labor is the most preferred option of many workers, is to knowingly act in a way which is likely to cause workers harm. Indeed, given that many potential sweatshop workers seem to express a strong preference for sweatshop labor over the alternatives, acting to remove that option is likely to cause them great harm. This is wrong. So in the same way it's wrong to stop to serve someone fish when they've requested that they don't like fish, it's also wrong to not enable someone to work in a sweatshop when they might desire to work in a sweatshop as opposed to some other alternative like being maybe a subsistence farmer. Now what Zwolinski does is once we've set the kind of meta-ethical and normatively ethical framework here for why choices should be respected, even choices that involve workers choosing, right, to work in sweatshops, he's able to then compile a succinct argument as to why, then, we should allow sweatshops to exist, and we should do so because we respect workers choosing to work in those sweatshops. So in the argument, the first premise is that most sweatshop workers choose to accept the conditions of their employment, even if their choice is made from among a severely constrained set of options. So even if the options are bad, the fact that one chooses one bad option over another bad option should still be respected. 2. The fact that they choose the conditions of their employment from within a constrained set of options is strong evidence that they view it as their most preferred option within that set. So the first premise, right, we respect it based on autonomy. The second one, we respect it based on their most preferred option. Third premise, the fact that they view it as their most preferred option is strong evidence that we will harm them by taking that option away. So we would be immoral by not respecting then the choice of the option, right, that they choose to exercise. The fourth premise, it is also plausible that sweatshop workers' choice to accept the conditions of their employment is sufficiently autonomous, and that therefore taking the option of sweatshop labor away from them would be a violation of their autonomy, and that in itself would be immoral. Premise 5. All else being equal, it is wrong to harm people or to violate their autonomy. Right? Therefore, conclusion, all else being equal, so we don't say that they were also maybe forced to work in those sweatshops as if they were enslaved. Therefore, it is wrong to take away the option of sweatshop labor from workers who would otherwise choose to engage in it. As Zwolinski says, workers' consent to the conditions of their labor should lead us to abandon certain moral objections to sweatshops, and perhaps even to view them as, on net, a good thing. Because this is still, even if we might want to say, I personally think sweatshops are disgusting, it's abusing workers. If workers are choosing to work in those conditions with their full autonomy, right, and they've looked at all the different options and they chose this option, it is immoral of me then to oppose their ability to work under those conditions. Now, what exactly does this mean? It means there are certain kinds of policies that should be opposed for moral reasons. The first is bans and boycotts. So we should not ban sweatshops and we should not boycott sweatshops. The reason is that we would violate their autonomy and we would violate or we would ignore the fact that they have chosen, right, that preference among other options. Zwolinski says, if goods made in sweatshops cannot be sold because we ban or boycott them, then it seems likely that sweatshops will stop producing such goods, and those who are employed in their production will be out of work, and we will be denying them an option they wish to exercise. There should also not be legal regulation of sweatshops, so it should not be the case that governments should determine the amount of wages that workers should be paid, such that they they don't work in, conditions which, pay them pennies on the dollar for a day's worth of work. As Zwolinski says, legal attempts to ameliorate working conditions in sweatshops by regulating the use of and pay for overtime, minimum wage laws, or workplace safety, for instance, raise the cost which sweatshops must incur to employ their workers, and that means sweatshops might end up closing, therefore denying workers the possibility of working in those sweatshops even if they wanted to in the first place. Finally, the argument opposes voluntary self-regulation. Now, what this means is that, as Zwolinski says, there's nothing in the argument that's opposed to voluntary self-regulation as such. So it's fine if a business owner wants to self-regulate. They don't want to pay their workers pennies on the dollar. But it's wrong for people to try to persuade owners to self-regulate. So, as Zwolinski says, there are, however, two significant causes for concern over the precise way in which the case for self-regulation has been made. First, to the extent that voluntary self-regulation is to be accomplished by the industry-wide standards, the regulation is really only voluntary for the industry as a whole. By establishing one standard with which all firms must comply, this sort of approach discourages individual firms from experimenting with their own standards. All right, so this means you're denying, in this case, right, the ability or the autonomy of owners to set for themselves the standards in which they want to employ people and the kinds of businesses they want to set up. The second and less well-recognized problem, Zwolinski says, is that by making the case for self-regulation in terms of the rights of workers have to certain forms of treatment and the obligations that MNEs, multinational enterprises, have to ensure such treatment, supporters of voluntary self-regulation end up putting too strong a demand on multinational enterprises for the kind of reform they desire, while paying insufficient attention to ways of helping workers that fall short of their desired goal. Now, what this means is that, opposed to perhaps our common intuition in thinking that sweatshops are immoral, Zwolinski is actually saying it is immoral to oppose sweatshops, right? And it is immoral to oppose sweatshops because we, one, violate the autonomy of people to choose to work somewhere. We deny them, right, the ability for themselves to choose for themselves. And we don't respect the choices they make, right? So we ignore those choices. Let's now look at Jeremy Snyder's article, Needs Exploitation, for why it is that sweatshops are actually immoral, so opposed to Zwolinski's argument, and what exactly needs exploitation is. Now, Snyder says that, human beings have this sense of well-being and flourishing, right? We can think back to Aristotle and this idea that human beings attempt to live a distinctively good life in ways that other non-human animals don't, right? A cat doesn't think, what is the best life I can live, right? They're mainly influenced by instinct. With the case of a human being, right, we can think about what is a good human life? How can human beings flourish? What does it mean to have well-being? So Snyder says that the goal of a decent minimum of well-being for all persons is based on a core intuition that we should have access to the basic goods necessary to live a distinctly human life. So it's the case that we can say it shouldn't be the case if it's possible for human beings to not be enslaved, for human beings to not live in poverty, if, right, people do have access to raise their level of well-being, right? So there should be a minimum standard if it's actually possible to implement that standard, such that human beings can live then a distinctively human life. Now, to live a good life, humans need support in a variety of dimensions of well-being. So a few of these Snyder lists. First, bodily support. So it's the case that, just think about the fact as a child needs support from a parent, right, giving them food and ensuring they have shelter. Well, human beings also need access to food and shelter and water and clothing. And we get this perhaps through support of our own body, through support of others, working together to ensure that those basic things are provided for us. Secondly, minimal education, right? So we need to be educated, one, just in general about certain things that we can and cannot eat, things that might be poisonous. But also, if we look at the context of, an advanced society, we understand that, well, people need a certain minimal education to navigate the society they live in such that they can be a productive member of society, right? This is why businesses typically want someone with maybe a high school education, or perhaps with other jobs, right? Might need more education, but they should at least be provided with the ability to, if they so choose, pursue a higher form of education. So Snyder's not saying everyone needs to be given higher education, but they need to be given a minimum amount of education such that if they did pursue higher education, they've been given the basic tools that allow them to do that. Finally, freedom from subordination. Human beings, one, should not be unnecessarily, influenced by instinct, right? This is why human beings possess reason and the ability to determine our own ends for ourselves. But we should also have negative liberty, right? We shouldn't have other human beings coming in and limiting what we have access to arbitrarily. We shouldn't have human beings physically stopping us from doing what we want to do. We should be free to pursue those. So, in general, we will appropriately value a distinctly human life for all when we understand humans as not merely animals, but human animals with the potential to endorse ends, right? To come up with desires, to come up with a conception of what I want to do in my life, right? And to not be denied the basic tools to pursue, right, on my own, that conception that I have come up with about the end I want to choose and how I think of myself as flourishing. So, there should be a decent minimum level of well-being for all persons. Now, most of those requirements of well-being involve the ways in which human beings relate to others. And it means that, right, we all actually need care. Sometimes we care for others. Sometimes we need care, as a child needs care from a parent. Friends sometimes rely on other friends for help, right? Or we have family members or spouses and so on, right? And in certain ways, we all rely on one another. Or maybe a coworker, right? Coworkers have to work together to complete a project. It would be wrong for one coworker to do nothing and let the project fail. It would be wrong for the parent to not take care of their child when their child relies on them. It would be wrong for a friend to turn their back on their friend in their time of need, because that's what it means to be a friend. So the perfect form of the duty of beneficence then relies on connections to particular others through our roles and relationships. That's what we determine what we owe to others, is through our roles and the kinds of roles we perform in relationships with others. So Snyder says, in the case of employment relationships, in short, employers do not simply have an imperfect duty to help some of their employees to achieve a decent minimum some of the time. Rather, employers are required to cede as much of their benefit from the interaction to their employees as is reasonably possible toward the end of the employees achieving a decent minimum standard of living. So we wouldn't say a parent, for example, only has to care for their child 8 hours of the day, right? And then the other 16 hours, the parent is off the hook, right? We would say that the parent has a duty 24 hours of the day to care for their child. In the same way, right? Well, first we should say why. Well, because what it means to be a parent is to help facilitate the growth of a human being and to ultimately be there for them when they need help, right? They are their guardian, right? So the relationship they have depends on certain roles. It's not the role of the child to treat the parent the way that the parent treats the child. So roles determine then what is expected from children. So children should respect the authority of parents, but also parents should provide beneficence, right, out of a sense of duty for the child. So if we look at employers and employees, we first look at their roles. Well, the role of an employee is to work for the employer to ultimately, of course, make profit for the employer. But what is the point of the employer? It's to provide subsistence in the means via wages for the employee to actually be able to live, right? That's why the employee comes to work for the employer, because they offer them means of subsistence. So the employer then has a certain duty to provide that employee with a certain amount of ability for a minimum decent standard of living, right? They need to pay them enough such that they can have a home, such that they can get transportation to go work, such that they have food to exist so they can work for the employer, as much as is reasonably possible. So the question then is, what is meant by reasonably possible in extending benefits to employees from employers? So first, Snyder says, the baseline for determining when needs exploitation takes place will be restricted by the normatively adjusted prospective dependence of B on A for X. So of, for example, the employee on the employer for wages. And this is largely determined by the kind of duration of the relationship within its contextual setting. So greater demands exist for longer and more intimate relationships, right? So the demand with which, or the obligation that, let's say, a spouse has to their a spouse, right? A husband to a wife or a wife to a husband is greater, of course, than someone who's been dating only 2 weeks. In the same way, there are differences between part-time and full-time work. So, greater job security and more wages should be given to someone that is working full-time as opposed to someone that is working part-time. Because, again, right, it depends on the role and then the expectation that is necessary to perform that role by the employer. Now, some roles, though, we can say are suspect. So it isn't always the case. It also depends on context. So it might be, the custom for the wife to always cook for the husband. But this does not mean that morally the husband ought to solely rely on the wife for all his meals, and that therefore the wife has an obligation to always cook for the husband, right? We might say that this is sexist. So sometimes context matters in these cases. Secondly, A should be permitted to retain the means to live a flourishing life and not live solely for the sake of B, such that A is required only to cede those shares of gain to B that would fund B's access to flourishing and not excess or deficit. So what this means is that it's not just the case that the owner should hire the worker such that the owner lives solely to provide the means of flourishing for the worker, but that the owner should also be permitted to retain the means to a flourishing life. So if it's the case that, let me put it this way. It shouldn't be the case that the owner should be paying the workers more than what the owner gets if it means the owner has to live in poverty for the workers to live in luxury, because then that would be denying the owner the means to a flourishing life. But it also shouldn't be the case that the owner is living in luxury while the workers are living in poverty, right? So there should be some kind of a mean between these two extremes. And Snyder admits the exact threshold between this deficit and excess is subject to debate, right? On the one hand, it's contextual because certain societies, the standard of living is different. But also on the other hand, what exactly it means to live a flourishing life can be different as well, based on technology, based on desires that might exist in any given society. Finally, the reasonability standard is governed by practical limitations on A's enterprise, such as competitiveness. So if it would be the case that global market demands would force A's business to shut down if they tried to pay a living wage, then Snyder says they don't have a moral obligation to pay a living wage because doing so would mean no one gets paid at all. And it's better that some get paid a little bit than nobody get paid at all. Because at least getting paid a little bit works more towards someone having a minimum standard of well-being, as opposed to if no one's getting paid, then no one has any access to well-being. So it's not the case, again, right, that the owner should just sacrifice everything for the sake of the employees, right? There's a middle ground, right? There's a mean between extremes. So what then is needs exploitation? When can we say that the owner of a business is engaging in needs exploitation? And why is it then that sweatshops are an example of needs exploitation? So Snyder says that the relevant baseline for what A owes to B is that A cede to B, right? Two things. First, A, C to B, so the owner gives to the employer, the employer or the owner gives to the employee as much as is reasonably possible of the zero-sum gain from the interaction until B, the worker, reaches a threshold in some dimension of well-being X. So whatever that well-being is determined to be. So, with the criteria of reasonability allowing that, 1, A, the owner, may retain levels of well-being between the limits of deficiency and luxury, right? So again, the owner has to pay the worker enough that they don't live in poverty, right? So they're not being deficient in the amount that they cede to the worker. But also, they don't have to provide the worker with a life of luxury, only that they allow them some minimum amount of well-being such that they are able to form their own desires and pursue their own desires. Right? That's the whole point. That's why a worker works for an owner, to be given the means of subsistence such that they can use their own mind to determine what do they want to do with their life and to be able to pursue, right, those dreams to some minimal extent, right, to have a baseline. So it doesn't mean the owner is guaranteed in making it possible or giving the worker, right, their dream, but they allow them some basic minimum threshold of well-being to, as a human being, right, create their own ends and pursue those ends. Secondly, of course, this also means that the goal of a decent minimum for all persons allows for deviations from the ideal forms of moral duties under non-ideal conditions. What this means is that someone, living in a society where the standard of living is much lower than in an industrialized country does not need to get paid the same amount of money as someone might in an industrialized country, for the fact that what it means to have a basic standard of well-being might be lower in an underdeveloped country as opposed to a developed country, right? So those non-ideal conditions play into the context of what it means for one to live a decent life. The second thing that determines how much A should cede to B is the extent they should exceed as much to B to the extent that B, the worker, normatively adjusted prospectively depends on A for X. So again, if it's the case that one is hired just for one day, that doesn't mean the owner must pay that contractor an entire life's worth of money to live, to have a basic amount of well-being for their entire life if they're only employed for one day. But it does mean someone who's a part-time worker that works, let's say, 15 hours a week regularly should, of course, get paid more and have more job security than the person hired for one day. And it should also be the case that the person who works full-time should have greater job security and get paid more than the person who works part-time, because of the extent to which those different groups of people rely on the owner for different amounts of subsistence, right? Again, it depends on the role that each person plays and then the relationship between those roles. Those are what determines then what it is an employer owes to the employees. Sweatshops, because they pay so little money and they are so dangerous, right? Many people get hurt or can get killed in sweatshops. Because of this, we can see, applying this formula, sweatshop owners do not cede to their workers the relevant amount of means of subsistence for those workers to have some basic amount of well-being. Right? In this way, sweatshop workers, as Snyder argues, engage in needs exploitation.